Hey guys, in this Monday morning tennis rant, I want to address my fellow Rafa fans. And for you guys that are active on social media, you know there's a lot of discussion about the big three. And some of my fellow Rafa fans are trying to make the argument that Rafa indeed is the greatest player of all time. And based on the information that I'm going to provide in this video, I'm trying to convince my fellow Rafa fans that this argument cannot be made. Rafa is not the greatest tennis player of all time. It is indeed Djokovic. And this is coming from one of the biggest Rafa fans of all time, me. Now, some of you guys accuse me of being a Djokovic fan. And how can I prove that I'm a Rafa fan? Well, I can show you some of my fan collector's items. I got Rafa hats. I got Rafa shirts out the yin yang. I don't know how many of these I have. I'm a huge Rafa fan, okay? I got the bag of Rafa. I even bought his rackets. And I've been a Rafa fan since exactly 2004. When he beat Federer in Miami in straight sets, I think it was 3-3. I found a liking to him, and I've been a super fan of Rafa ever since. And there was a video that I planned to release on the Intuitive Tennis YouTube channel titled, "What's More Nerve-Wracking, Playing Tennis or Watching Tennis?" And I ended up unlisting this video because I told some stories about my daughter's junior career that I didn't really want out there. So I decided not to post this publicly. But the most nerve-wracking thing for me was watching my daughter play. It's much more nerve-wracking than playing tennis because while it is nerve-wracking to play, you have some adrenaline pumping, and yes, you're nervous, but it's far worse to sit in the stands and watch. But a close second to my daughter playing, as far as nerves being wrecked, was watching Rafa. I could not even stand watching those finals, and what I would do is actually go in my car, start driving around, and follow the score on my phone. I simply couldn't stand watching it. And look, since I'm a huge Rafa fan, I understand that you guys are trying to make the argument that Rafa is the greatest, and it is very, very close. This argument has some validity to it because we're talking about different surfaces. It can get quite confusing, but I'm going to break it all down in today's video, and it's going to make a lot of sense. But first, I want to read to you some of the arguments that Rafa fans have made on Twitter, mostly, why Rafa is the greatest player of all time. So the first argument is the number of slams missed. Nadal missed 15 slams, Djokovic missed 3. Nadal missed 3 Olympics, Djokovic missed 0. A lot of Rafa fans always bring up Olympics because Djokovic hasn't won the Olympic gold medal yet. And Grand Slams plus Olympics won, Nadal and Djokovic are tied at 24. And let me just comment on the fact that Nadal has had far more injuries than Djokovic. Sometimes injuries can be bad luck, but other times injuries can come from other factors. And you have to give Djokovic credit for taking care of his body and being unbelievably professional, taking care of his diet, doing all those stretching routines and all that. Even Nadal himself admitted that he could have done more in those terms throughout his career. And the next one is kind of funny to me because Rafa fans are bringing up terminology that I've never heard before. And let me read you some of this stuff. So I already told you Djokovic never won Olympic gold. And a lot of Rafa fans are really focused on that. Agassi never won the Channel Slam. Now you guys are probably wondering what in the world is a Channel Slam. So a Channel Slam refers to the channel between France and England. So if you win the French Open and then Wimbledon back-to-back, that is a Channel Slam. Federer never won DCGS. Now what in the world is DCGS? Well, it's the double career Grand Slam. And Nadal has done it all, and they usually put like a goat emoji behind it. So of course, if you look at it that way, you could call Nadal the GOAT, but it gets a little bit more complicated than that. And just stay with me in this video. I'm going to explain it. It's going to make a lot more sense. Okay, the next one people bring up the win streak. So Nadal's longest win streak on hardcourt is 30 matches. Djokovic's longest win streak on hardcourt is 35 matches. The difference is 5. Nadal's longest win streak on clay is 81 matches, and Djokovic's longest win streak on clay is 17 matches. The difference there is 64, and for that reason, Nadal is GOAT. Now we're talking about surfaces, and I'm going to give you a detailed list of who I think are the greatest players of all time based on surface. So this argument, while it does sound pretty good for Rafa fans, is not going to hold up. Another argument that Nadal fans bring up is the fact that Nadal dominated Federer and Djokovic in their respective primes. And Federer's prime was supposedly between 2004 and 2009, which I, by the way, don't agree with. And Djokovic's prime supposedly was between 2011 and 2016. So Nadal won 6 majors during Federer's prime, and Djokovic has won 1. And Nadal won 5 majors during Djokovic's prime, and Federer won 1. So for that reason, Nadal is the GOAT. And listen, when we're talking about prime, you have to take a look at when a player started playing poorly. So let me just give you one example, and that is Andy Murray. So he's obviously not in his prime right now. So he used to be ranked in the top 4 consistently, and was even ranked number 1 at some point. So obviously, once he stopped getting those results, he was out of his prime. But when we're talking about the big 3, these guys were in their prime from when they entered the top 10 until they retired. In Federer's case, that last year, you can kind of draw a cross through that one because he was injured. But the year before Federer got injured, his second to last year of playing, he was still absolutely in his prime. And the same can be said for Nadal. We're talking about the year 2022, Nadal was in his prime right before we got injured, and obviously Djokovic is still in his prime. And the last argument that I'm going to read to you is the worst one that I've seen recently, and that's the fact that Nadal has the highest win percentage of all time versus players who are ranked number 1 in the world, which sounds really good, but I don't like it because it means that Rafa wasn't ranked number 1, and that's why he beat so many number 1. So Nadal has a 54.8 percentage of beating players who are ranked number 1 in the world, followed by Boris Becker and then Novak Djokovic at 47.1%. Okay, now we're going to break it all down. It's going to make a lot of sense because I'm going to list the greatest players of all time based on the surface. And let's start off with clay. And there's absolutely no argument to be made. Rafael Nadal is the greatest clay court player in the history of tennis. No one comes close. Now, at number 2, I'm going to put Novak Djokovic. Why? Because Novak Djokovic had to compete with Rafa. If it wasn't for Rafa, Novak Djokovic would be the greatest clay court player in the history of tennis. I base this on his 3 French Open titles. I also based this on the fact that he has beaten Nadal many times on clay and the amount of Masters title that Djokovic has collected on clay. And that's why I'm putting him at number 2 of all time on clay, ahead of Bjorn Borg, who comes in at number 3. And now let's talk about grass, and this is where it's going to get a little bit controversial, and I might upset some of you Fed fans because I think that Novak Djokovic is the greatest grass court player in the history of tennis, despite the fact that he has 1 less Wimbledon title than Federer. Djokovic has 7, Federer has 8. I'm going to put Federer at number 2. Why? Because Djokovic is 3-0 against Federer in Wimbledon finals. I just cannot bring myself to place Federer above Djokovic on grass when he lost to Djokovic in 3 of the most important grass matches in their respective careers. At 3, I'm going to put Sampras. At 4, I'm going to put Borg. At 5, I'm going to put Becker. At 6, I'm going to put McEnroe. And between 7 and 8 is a toss-up. I was thinking about putting Edberg at number 7, but I'm going to put Nadal at number 7 and Edberg at number 8. Now, I want to make a huge caveat to what I just said because grass used to be a lot faster, and I'm basing these rankings on fast grass. If we're talking about the more modern grass, the slower grass that's supposedly growing in the wrong direction against the ball that slows everything down, I am putting Rafael Nadal at number 3 as the 3rd greatest grass court player of all time. Yes, I've said it. Nadal was in 5 Wimbledon finals. He won 2. He could have won a lot more Wimbledons. He got unlucky a couple times. And now let's talk about hardcourt. And here, there's no doubt in my mind that Djokovic is the greatest hardcourt player in the history of tennis. I've never seen a player move better on hardcourt, play better on hardcourt. And you could make an argument that Federer is very close, but looking at the head-to-head, looking at the overall results and Tour finals, Masters Series tournaments, Grand Slams at the Australian Open and the US Open, to me, Djokovic is the greatest hard court player of all time, followed by Federer. And at number 3, and this might come as a surprise, I'm going to put Rafael Nadal. And Rafael Nadal often gets overlooked for his accomplishments on hard court, the amount of Master Series tournaments that he's won, the 6 Grand Slam titles, 4 at the US Open, 2 in Australia. You have to remember that he was competing against Federer and Djokovic, the 2 other greatest hard court players of all time, and he's beaten them a lot of times in hard court finals. So for that reason, I gotta put Nadal at number 3 ahead of Sampras, ahead of Agassi as the 3rd greatest hard court player of all time. And when I put these numbers together and average them out across all surfaces, we can see that Djokovic is the greatest hard court player of all time. He's the greatest grass court player of all time. He's the 2nd greatest clay court player of all time. So it is clear that Djokovic is the greatest player of all time compared to Rafa and Fed. So let's look at Rafa. Rafa is the 3rd best hard court player of all time. If we give Rafa the benefit of only judging the modern grass courts, he's the 3rd best grass court player of all time. And of course, he's the greatest clay court player of all time. So me as a Rafa fan, I cannot call him the greatest of all time above Djokovic. And the same can be said for Federer. Look, you can make an argument that Federer is the greatest of all time on grass because he has 8 Wimbledons. Okay, so let's just say that Federer is the greatest grass court player of all time. You cannot call Federer the greatest hard court player of all time, but even if you did, let's just make that argument and you say that Federer is the greatest hard court player of all time, Federer is nowhere near Djokovic's skills on clay court. I wouldn't even put Federer in the top 5 on clay. So you cannot make an argument that Federer is the greatest all time compared to Djokovic, because Djokovic, in my opinion, is the 2nd greatest clay court player in the history of the game. And often when people discuss the GOAT, they bring up what these players have brought to the game. And while this is a fine argument to make, of course, Nadal and Federer have brought a tremendous amount of value to the game. In my opinion, Djokovic has as well. This has absolutely nothing to do with the greatness of a player. What is the greatness of a player judged on? Is judged on the player's results in the most important tournaments. And recently in an interview, Nadal said the same thing. He said that based on the numbers, Djokovic is the greatest of all time. But I understand that some of my fellow Rafa fans are looking for ways to call Rafa the greatest of all time, because it is very close between all these guys. Okay, there's not much to give there because they are all so great. The differences are so small, maybe 1%. But in the world of sports, results are the most important thing. That's what we have to go by. And this is why Djokovic is the greatest player of all time. In my opinion, this topic is over because unfortunately, I don't think that Rafa has much left in the tank. From what I'm hearing, he still has a tremendous amount of pain when he practices, and I think that when he comes back, it's probably going to be a farewell tour. Of course, you can't ever count out Rafa. He is an unbelievable fighter, and he might do quite well, but I don't see him to be at the same level as Djokovic and Alcaraz. I think his body took a beating, and he's pretty close to the end, so it's going to be difficult for Rafa to add to these numbers, while on the other hand, I do think that Djokovic has a lot left in the tank, and the more he plays, the more he is going to solidify his place as the greatest player in the history of the game.